In this video, you're going to build a grid which is slightly more advanced than the one you built in the previous videos. And this time you're going to use the grid areas, which means that you're going to decide that one of your grid items is going to occupy a few rectangles inside your grid. So let's go ahead and do this. Now, before I start, let's do a little bit of terminology just to make sure everything is clear. The grid or grid container is the element that contains all your grid items. So your grid items are the divs that you place inside the container. So Apple, for example, is a grid item. Now, if you look at this, for example, or this gap between two columns, or this gap between two rows, that's what we call a grid line. All right. And if you look at a row or the content between two lines, then that is what we would call a grid track. Now, each of these rectangles that you see there in the templates, that's a grid cell. And later on, when we move to grid areas, those are going to be a combination of grid cells. So for example, these 4 grid cells, that could be a grid area that you set as the space occupied by one of the grid items. All right. So let's go ahead and build our example. So I'm going to keep only 5 divs in our new example. So 5 grid items inside the grid container. Now let's go to the styling and let's change the dimensions that we set for the rows and columns. So first of all, I'm going to make the container take a height of 100 VH, meaning that it's going to span over the full height of the web page. Now let's go to the rows, and let's say that our new template is going to have 3 rows and 3 columns. So I'm going to set the height of the first row to 50 pixels, then the second one or the last one to 50 pixels as well, and then the middle one to 1 free space. So any remaining space after giving the first and last 50 pixels is going to go to the second row. Then let's go to the columns. And let's say that the first column is going to have 20% and the last one 20% and the middle one any remaining space. So at the moment, it's not very clear what we're doing. So just to clarify, I'm going to add a few more items just to fill the templates. So 9 items will fill the current template before we move to grid areas. All right. So at the moment, if you look at this example, it's still a simple grid where each grid item occupies 1 cell. So 9 grid items and 9 cells. 3 rows and 3 columns. Now, let's move to what we call grid areas. So I'm going to use a property called grid template areas, where I'm going to divide my template to several areas. So the idea here is to make Apple, for example, occupy the first top cells. Let's add a semicolon just to get the gap appearing again. So Apple is going to occupy those 3 cells. So inside my templates, I'm going to have a first line, which is going to be something like Apple, then Apple, then Apple. Basically, this means that I called the first 3 cells inside the first row. I called each one of these areas Apple, then Apple, then Apple. Then I'm going to move to the next row, and I'm going to do the same thing, but this time, let's say that the grid item Facebook is going to occupy that cell. So let's call that Facebook. Then Microsoft is going to go right there. So I'm going to have Microsoft after Facebook, and make sure you've got a space between these two. And then after that, I'm going to have Samsung going right there. Then let's have a third one for the last row. So Google is going to occupy these 3 cells. So I'm going to call the first one Google, the second one Google, and the third one Google as well. So at the moment, this has not changed anything to our layout because we're not done yet. So what you need to do now is go to each of these grid items and tell the browser what areas they are going to occupy inside your templates by using the grid area property. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to give each of these items an ID to make it simple. Then I'm going to go back to the styling sheets, and then I'm going to select each of them and then tell the browser what area they are going to occupy using the grid area property. So for Apple, I want it simply to occupy the Apple area, which spans over 3 cells inside the first row. So all I need to do is say grid area set to Apple, like this. And this will make this grid item, Apple, occupy the 3 cells in the template, like this. Great, isn't it? Now just make sure that you write Apple without any quotes. Also, the names that I chose for the IDs, they don't matter really. But if you choose the same IDs as the names you put inside the templates or the areas, then it will just make your code more readable. Okay? Now I will need to select all the other grid items and do exactly the same. So I'm going to select Facebook and say that Facebook is going to occupy this area. And here we go. Then I'm going to select all the other ones. So I'm going to set Microsoft to occupy the Microsoft's area, which is between Facebook and Samsung. And I'm going to do the same thing to Samsung, setting its area to Samsung. And finally, Google is going to be set to Google, which will give it 3 cells in the last row. Now let's see why Google didn't work. Well, if I check the ID of Google, it's supposed to be Google like this. And let's delete all the extra items. And now you can see how we distributed the space between our grid items using grid areas. So again, Apple occupies 3 cells, Facebook occupies 1 cell, just like Microsoft and Samsung, and then Google occupies 3 cells at the bottom of the template. So this way, you can easily make any grid item occupy a certain set of cells inside your template. Now, what if you want to change your layouts in small screens? You can easily use media queries and just change the values that you set for the grid templates areas, the grid templates rows, and the grid templates columns. So let's go ahead and do this. So for example, let's make sure that in small screens, we've got only one column and our elements are just stacked one on top of the other. So our new template is going to be as following. So let's use media queries for all screens. And let's set the maximum width to something like 700 pixels. So I'm going to select the container and set its grid templates areas and change the dimensions of the rows and columns. So let's set this to Facebook, then Apple, then Microsoft, then Samsung, then Google. Now let's change the height of the rows. And let's go for 50 pixels, then 100 pixels, for example, 100 pixels, and then 50 pixels. And let's have one free space for Microsoft. So whatever remains is going to go for Microsoft. And let's change the grid template columns to one free space. And we've got only one value because we want only one column. So now if I reduce the width of the browser underneath 700 pixels, then you can see that we have just changed the layouts very easily just by changing our template using media queries. Now, at the moment, we are going desktop first because we are setting our styling for big screens, and then we are specifying the styling that we would use for small screens. Now, if you want to go for mobile first, then this is supposed to be your main styling and have this as your extra styling that you put inside your media query. So this will look like this. So I'm going to copy all of that inside the media query. And then we're going to copy that inside our main styling, like this. And then I'm going to use min width instead of max width. It's still going to give us the same results, but in your coding, you're actually coding mobile first, which is a good practice. So if I reduce the width and the 700 pixels, then I've got the new layout. Perfect. All right, in the next video, you're going to build a new grid layout using a form, but this time your template is going to control the dimensions of the columns without having to look at the rows. So what's going to happen is that whatever you add to your form is going to fit into the template just by looking at the dimensions of the columns.